In the history of engineering disasters, the mystery doesn't always lie in the major event itself, but in the subtle details captured by a single witness from a unique angle. On the morning of September 11th, 2001, while the world watched the catastrophe unfold live, a video camera mounted on the 39th floor of 40 Harrison Street was recording over 49 minutes of footage that would later become one of the most controversial visual documents in modern history. These recordings, filmed by Richard Peskin, went far beyond being a personal video. They became an official file under the designation NIST FOIA R14 UC Peskin 01-44, a document that doesn't merely recount the story of an attack, but provides a rigorous visual testimony of the structural failure that followed the impact. Today, we dive into the precise timestamps documented in the file's official summary and raise the engineering questions that this footage sparked, from the glowing material flowing from the South Tower to the pressure pulses shaking the North Tower. This is not an emotional journey, but a cold, analytical examination of visual evidence placed under the microscope of global engineering debate. The first question we must ask is, what allowed Peskin's camera to capture what others couldn't? The answer lies in location and angle. From its high northern vantage point, the camera observed subtle details at the top of the towers, far from the dust and chaos of the streets. This position is precisely what enabled it to record the most critical evidence of internal heat and structural failure moments before the collapse. The greatest mystery in the Peskin footage is condensed into 1 minute and 36 seconds of recording. At 9:57 a.m., just 10 minutes before the collapse of the South Tower, the camera captured a visual phenomenon that remains at the center of engineering controversy to this day. It was a stream of molten, glowing material pouring from the northeast corner of the South Tower, precisely between floors 80 and 81. This liquid, intensely luminous and clearly molten, defied conventional explanations based on ordinary office fires. The official report by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, claimed that the material was molten aluminum from the airplane wreckage, noting that aluminum melts at a much lower temperature than steel. However, this explanation opens the door to several chemical and physical complications. First, the color of the glow. Pure aluminum does not emit a bright yellow or white yellow glow, like the one seen in Peskin's footage, unless it is exposed to temperatures far beyond those typical of office fires. This intense brightness indicates extreme internal heat, which led many engineers to dismiss the simple aluminum hypothesis. Second, the source of the flow, the molten material, appeared to be coming from an area near the building's core columns. That means the thermal damage was concentrated at the structural heart of the tower, which was supposed to be the most protected zone. If this was merely residual aluminum, why did it emerge precisely from that location? Then comes the deeper chemical debate. Many experts go further, suggesting that the footage might indicate an active chemical reaction known as thermite or even nanothermite. These materials generate temperatures high enough to melt steel and produce the exact same intense glow. Although the official investigation denied any evidence of thermite, Peskin's footage of the molten flow remains the strongest visual argument cited by skeptics. This was not a random leak. It was, to many eyes, a clear sign of internal failure that still defies complete explanation. While the molten material served as the chemical key, what Peskin documented in the North Tower WTC-1 provided the structural and physical key to the mystery. At 10:18 a.m., a new and striking phenomenon appears: violent pressure pulses. The smoke is not merely seeping out, it is being forcibly expelled through the windows of floors 92, 93, and 95. These bursts of pressure cannot be explained by the slow spread of smoke or fire. Instead, They suggest that a sudden internal force created immense pressure within the trapped air of those floors. Engineering analysis. These pressure pulses indicate that the internal failure was abrupt and catastrophic, occurring well before the tower's total collapse. This could signify a sudden failure of a group of core columns or a widespread detachment of floor slabs, both of which would instantaneously compress and expel the air and smoke outward. This footage stands as visual evidence that the North Tower was not failing gradually or symmetrically. It was disintegrating internally and rapidly. When comparing this observation to theoretical models, it raises the debate between progressive collapse and what some engineers term spontaneous or intrinsic failure. In the progressive collapse model, structural failure begins at a single critical point, such as a weakened column or floor, and spreads downward in a sequential chain reaction. Each floor impacts the one below, amplifying momentum until total collapse occurs. However, the intrinsic failure model argues that multiple structural components, core columns, trusses, and floor connections may have failed nearly simultaneously due to internal stresses, thermal expansion, or other intense forces. In this scenario, the collapse does not propagate progressively, but rather erupts from within, producing sudden expulsions of pressure, dust, and debris, exactly like those seen in Peskin's footage. Thus, the 1018 sequence is not merely an image of smoke, it is a snapshot of structural chaos, revealing that the North Tower's core integrity was collapsing inward long before its exterior gave way. Then came the collapse that stopped the world from breathing, the fall of the South Tower. But this event was not the end of a story. It was the beginning of a chain of engineering questions. Peskin's footage of that moment became the core material for analyzing the collapse pattern. What his camera recorded helped give rise to the pancake collapse theory. The idea that the floors above the impact zone failed first, triggering a cascading effect as the accumulated weight caused the lower floors to collapse in rapid succession. However, the molten material footage, captured 10 minutes before the collapse, raises a deeper question. Was this collapse purely the result of a dynamic force, the plane impact and subsequent fire, or was it accelerated by a continuing structural, thermal, and possibly chemical failure that had already compromised the tower's core? When the North Tower later fell, Peskin's camera captured the fragmentation and descent of its central core remains. These weren't just fragments of debris, they were visual evidence that the steel core columns themselves were disintegrating. The North Tower's core, designed to withstand hurricane force winds, was collapsing in on itself. This raised one of the most controversial engineering debates: the speed of the collapse. Frame-by-frame analysis of Peskin's footage allows engineers to measure the rate of debris fall, leading some to argue that the descent occurred at near freefall speeds, a rate that, in theory, would require the near-simultaneous removal of structural resistance across multiple floors. Thus, Peskin's recordings leave us with a visual enigma, a haunting, unanswered question about how the Twin Towers' cores disintegrated with such uniform speed and precision. We now move to the most controversial building in that entire sequence of events: World Trade Center 7 WTC 7. It was never hit by an airplane, and yet it collapsed 7 hours later in a pattern that closely resembled a controlled demolition. Although Peskin's camera did not capture the actual collapse, it recorded something even more crucial: the auditory warning. Peskin's tape documented a loud explosive sound followed by a dense cloud of smoke near the eastern facade of the building. This was the first audible signal ever recorded around this mysterious structure. But the real controversy comes from the subsequent sounds. At one point, a much louder bang was captured, and about a minute and a half later, another distinct explosion-like sound was heard. These noises, recorded an hour and a half before the collapse, remain acoustic evidence of unusual internal activity occurring inside or near WTC-7. The official explanation claims these were likely explosions from diesel fuel tanks located in the lower floors, which powered the emergency generator systems. The opposing theory, however, argues that the intensity and timing of these blasts are consistent with small, deliberate charges intended to weaken the internal structure in preparation for a controlled collapse. Today, these recorded sounds from the Peskin archive have become an inseparable part of every serious analysis of the WTC-7 collapse. They form an auditory counterpart to the visual evidence of scattered, asymmetrical fires visible on the lower floors toward the end of that catastrophic day. What remains in Peskin's footage is a haunting image, a smoldering, blackened pile of ruins, the final visual frame of the Peskin document, and yet paradoxically the beginning of the biggest unanswered questions that still echo to this day. In conclusion, the Peskin document is not just a video, it is an engineering time record, publicly accessible, that confronts us with precise visual and auditory evidence challenging any single, simplified explanation of the event. The molten material 9:57 a.m. evidence of extreme internal heat, far exceeding what an ordinary office fire could produce, casting doubt on the idea of thermal failure alone. The pressure pulses 10:18 a.m. proof of a sudden and violent internal structural failure inside the North Tower minutes before total collapse. The sounds and explosions prior to the collapse of WTC-7, an auditory record of unusual internal activity surrounding the most controversial building of them all. Critique of official investigations, the failure of official reports to provide a comprehensive and convincing explanation for these visual and acoustic anomalies is precisely what has kept the Peskin footage alive and at the center of engineering debate. This document continues to challenge engineers and scientists to pursue the structural truth behind one of the most astonishing collapses in modern history. Final message: these few recorded minutes are not only a reminder of the tragedy, they are an open invitation to keep questioning the fine engineering details that led to it. It is a document that puts steel, chemistry, and physics under the microscope. Share your thoughts in the comments. Based on the visual evidence captured by Peskin, what do you believe is the most logical explanation for the molten material phenomenon? And do you think the investigation into the collapse of WTC-7 is truly complete?